So to end the day, we had a large topic to discuss. Coming from various backgrounds and having a lot of complexities around different regions and different institutions, we had to first understand what it means for different sectors or different organizations, what it means to get or what it means for them, cities or regions to help with the lower carbon procurement and to set a standard. And there was a lot of talk today about the the carrot and stick approach, but there's another way of looking at it, and it's instead of reward punishment model, we looked at it as more of an incentive. So the carrot is something that you strive for. So if we look at different organizations and different businesses or institutions, what does it mean for the city to incentivize them? So they need to understand for their own needs. They could be educational or commercial or housing regeneration needs. What are their own challenges and how their particular region can address that? And then a little bit more on like the wider picture. What is the region on the Langer in the German context can do in across different regions. So complexities are enough across borders, but they're just equally challenging across local authorities, across regions as well. So how do they communicate and set the same standard? The second kind of topic that we looked at, or breaking down a little bit what it means to work on a regional level is also not only a top-down approach, but also a bottom-up approach. So how do we define what a low carbon best practice looks like in terms of procurement within the region, but also moving forward, can we become more focused, because now we're not talking about national level, we are only talking about regional, sometimes city level. So can we become a little bit more focused on how we approach procurement? There was a lot of talk today about setting carbon targets, but a lot of the time reused or refurbishment and retrofit of the existing building stock is something that is not always captured in whole life carbon assessments, but we know for a fact that is the most low carbon solution to decarbonizing the upfront or the procurement process, let's say. And the outcomes were for the first one, we looked at it within the UK context and within the US because we had different audience, and interestingly, it was quite similar in terms of the incentives that businesses and institutions need and the challenges that they face. So in the UK, low carbon procurement happens only really for, or it's captured within larger projects. And we see big cities delivering innovation, but when we look at across the region, smaller cities not often have the capacity or the knowledge or the technical expertise to even create a strategy, or if they do, that's not always communicated to other cities across the same region. And we also understood that local authorities actually have a big role to play in ensuring that educating communities across the region, just transferring that information between those different actors is it's one position that they can easily take. In the US, as I said, similar challenges. Rural communities also need leveling up in comparison to bigger cities, but at the same time, it is understood that bigger cities are the ones that drive the needle, the ones that create innovation. So they need to collaborate better to achieve leveling up. On a regional level, again, joint approach, sharing of information, but also regions need to understand that different communities have different needs. So not always the same benchmark, for example, for low carbon concrete on this region will be the exact same benchmark in a different region where the decarbonization of that particular product. And we're talking a lot about concrete because especially in the UK, concrete is probably the most used material for regeneration in housing. Timber is becoming increasingly difficult. So if we are to look at this very kind of carbon intensive material, we have to understand that it could be that UK is best suited to create the concrete within a particular region where this particular regeneration needs to happen, and then try to reuse its own resources. So upskilling, again, we understood that that's very crucial. Design teams and procurement processes within cities, but also whoever is delivering against them. So if a tender has very high ambition, if it's a top-down tender from a local government and it's hit by a developing community within a different region which doesn't quite understand the complexities around sourcing low carbon materials, then there is a huge risk of that delivery being tampered. The bottom-up approach, again, more exposure to best practice. We need a lot more information to accelerate policy, and this is what we know now from policymakers, is that they need that evidence base. So sharing what best practice looks like, learning from each other, and creating more confidence in the low carbon procurement process. Focusing on early stage technical assistance is quite crucial. So again, early design stages, if we have embedded, let's say, pre-redevelopment audits or other mechanisms which capture existing materials on site in very, very highly urbanized areas, inner cities or local places like London, which is very highly urbanized, it's absolutely crucial that, for example, a pre-demolition audit is the starting point to any kind of design brief setting and any design thinking. So a lot of the technical expertise is focused on how do we design with existing building elements. Again, that is not given, and it happens quite a lot in big cities. So how do we also transfer that knowledge to local communities in a more practical way? We understand that landowners are in probably the best position to do all this innovative infrastructure and low carbon development projects, because they can test things without risking too much, for example, storing of materials or reusing a material that they know where they comes from. One of the biggest challenges in reusing a lot of the materials is because design teams do not know where the material is coming from. So getting on board the same design team that developed the building before and trying to create a new build environment with the existing elements is one way of doing it, but also understanding that you have the land to do so. We were given an example with Westminster City Council. Westminster is highly urbanized. There's no land to store materials. So if you're a big landowner and if you have the capacity to store materials for future reuse, that is something that needs to be considered now and needs to be embedded also in the local planning policy. So the local policymakers, they can start allocating sites particularly for storage reuse. And finally, we looked at innovative solutions. So unfortunately, we still see that the most ambitious projects happen within the private sector, not within kind of the public tenders. But also that makes progress quite in that direction quite tricky because risk is quite high for the supply chain. A lot of developers are unsure if some materials will be available by the time of constructing their building, so they cannot commit to really high recycled and reused content, and that of course leads to almost business as usual. So how do we make reuse more economically viable? It's a very, very big question. How do we scale up? One way of doing it, I guess, is learning again from previous experience, but also pushing the boundaries that will require deep collaboration between the private and the public sector. And final point we had was that setting upfront carbon limits per building level, that it's informed by whole life carbon assessment and the local needs of the community in combination with very early kind of circular design thinking is probably the most effective approach that we could think at the moment in accelerating policy, because that we know roughly that is probably a framework format that is working. And as I said before, policymakers want to understand that if they are to embed something in policy, it's something that it's working. It's not going to stall growth and development in the way that we understand it anyway. The final map is, there was a big question of should we commit to a target, to a specific number? Can we say that by 2030 or 2050 we can halve our raw material extraction use in our procurement? That is of course a big question, but I think the bottom line was that we can commit as well as comply. So we need both the bottom up, but also the top down approach.
I hope yes, my microphone is working.
Once again, our workshop was how can decision makers around the world optimally seize the opportunities for industrial decarbonization offered by the Buy Clean movement and by other green public procurement movements. And I would say that, oh, we don't have a presentation. Yeah, we don't have a presentation because how dare you ask such a large question? It is very difficult to get down to all of our answers, but we'll do what we can. So it touches on so many different possible topics. What opportunities are there for decision makers for industrial decarbonization? Well, we touched on many of these different topics, including the fact that procurement itself, which is the main point of Buy Clean and these other movements, is that procurement is less prescriptive than a lot of other types of policies. It is technology agnostic, and so it allows for the work of loads of other folks throughout the supply chain to choose how they would like to clean up their materials and products. They can decide what is best and run with that. It's not telling them how to do it. It's merely asking for the cleanest possible product. And so it is up to the private sector to determine what that is. Of course, as I was saying earlier about Buy Clean is not merely the standards themselves, but also the investment. And so there is some level of direct investment from the federal government, but it is an encouraging policy in that it provides a lot of opportunity for decision makers to just let the market determine what is best, and it therefore can address lots of different factors, including as we discussed, recyclability and loads of other points. But Rixt, I would turn it to you as well, if you have anything.
Yeah, I think what we talked about as well during the discussion about the bike clean movement is that it can be a precursor just to try different things out because it's a more open approach, and then to move towards different opportunities of more setting things in stone. Yeah, also talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, which can also be seen as almost like a pilot program. And yeah, having the opportunity to almost jumpstart a movement. And I think this relates as well to the presentation that just happened about carrots and sticks, and almost that progression of it. Yeah, one thing that I found really interesting was that we almost talked a lot about challenges as well, which brought to my mind that often like those challenges are the biggest opportunities as well. And we talked a lot about global inclusion because now the Buy Clean Act, for example, only focuses on production within of materials within the US. Yeah, so that push for global inclusion is one of the biggest opportunities that we identified. Yeah, and how to do that is also, for example, by creating just spaces in order to discuss these topics, getting different groups in alignment.
Yeah, exactly. I would say that the Buy Clean movement within the United States is highly inward focused. It allows for inward thinking and improving the United States, but that doesn't necessarily address the larger issue of climate change as a whole. And so it certainly doesn't drive enough ambition. It is very much focused on what can be done within the United States, and to a certain degree, it encourages other countries and the companies that exist within those countries that if you would like to sell into this market, you must be this clean. But of course, the investments are not going to other countries. They're very intentionally supposed to be limited to the United States itself. But what that provides is first a recognition that there are gaps, that it does bring about these challenges, and that provides an opportunity for continued conversation, for increased tent building. One of the things that I was very proud of the fact that Buy Clean brought was that it, over the course of many years, these discussions brought, as I noted earlier, the BlueGreen Alliance itself, a coalition of labor unions and environmental groups to the table to support this, but also many folks within industry and the policymakers, the decision makers themselves. How frequently can you say that labor, environmental groups, industry, and politicians are in agreement that this is a good policy? That is exceedingly rare, but it's not enough. And so it's important that we need to focus on environmental justice as well. And so recognize that this is an inherently, as I said earlier, US-centric, could potentially be expanded more to Europe, perhaps to Korea, Japan, but that and others, but it certainly ignores much of the global South. And we need to recognize that and address that going forward. There's also the issue of supply chain tracking and the challenges that come with that, and just exactly where all of these products are being sourced from. And so there's a lot of opportunity that we discussed as well. For instance, I don't fully understand it, but the importance and the opportunity that blockchain presents in all of keeping track of all of the data mapping of this effort, and how, for instance, a single product could potentially have tracking information that is associated with all of the different inputs that went into it. And then if that were then to be used as a component in a subsequent manufactured product, then that data could be added to the others, which we would hope would go beyond simply carbon emissions, but other pollutants, and ideally getting into issues of human rights as well, because as we know, much of the world's goods are being produced in countries with horrible environmental standards and worse labor standards. And so this is a ongoing process. Is there anything else that you have to add?
No, I think it's mainly that the reason why we started this discussion of how to almost harmonize this standardization is in order to kind of figure out what are the opportunities for opening it up to more global, a global sphere. So yeah, I think I think we've covered the important parts of what we discussed. Yeah.
Yep, thank you so much.
Yeah, so first of all, we found that obviously there are like lots of different ways of how you could coordinate. We talk about methodologies, potentially procurement criteria or regulation. So there are lots of different things we can talk about when we talk about coordination. So there's obviously a trade-off between breadth and depth. And that also links to challenges. Should we just, because we were saying, okay, the EU is very good at standardizing, but do other countries necessarily want to buy that entire package? Do they want to adopt European standards? And we can see that already the EU and the US have different standards for EPDs. And often for many countries, they don't have the data supply lines to actually satisfy European data requirements. So if you insist on those, that could also alienate other countries. So the question is, should you try to optimize European standardization and European regulation while alienating other countries, or do you try to get them on board, potentially much bigger emerging markets like China and India and Brazil? Do you try to get them on board, maybe be a bit more lighter on data requirements and have more of an engagement with them? So there was the idea that actually the European Union NAFTA could coordinate a bit, but then our friends from the Blue-Green Alliance pointed out that they saw that as rather a race to the bottom and not particularly promising. So there is quite a danger of path-dependent lock-ins. Stuart was mentioning that with a long durée historical perspective, then maybe we shouldn't be all locked into limestone anyway. Maybe we should have 100 years or 150 years, 200 years maybe. We should have decided for clay instead of limestone. So that's very interesting, and also chimes in with something else, which is that really small alternative materials producers, they are often locked out of discussions on standardization. They cannot afford sending people there. They don't have the time, attention, resources. So that might also lead to a reinforcement of path-dependent developments. And then also, when it comes to national, so harmonization and coordination may be well worth pursuing, but the Californian example shows that there's also a lot of value if lower level units, subnational actors can charge ahead and create models for other countries or other jurisdictions to adopt. And in that sense, Californian legislation has been quite an inspiration for other US states, and also it kind of generates a repository of policies that can also be adopted at the federal level. What's quite interesting currently is this revamp in the European Union, this revamp of the Eco-Design Directive into a regulation, which could also address embodied emissions. But part of the justification for doing that at such a high level is that apparently there are already initiatives or actions being taken at member state level. And the idea is to have a more harmonized market and preempt individual standardization or regulation at the national level. So there is a kind of trade-off between harmonization and the common market and the ambition of national level actors. So I think something that could be seeming that I think there was a bit of a consensus on that it's worthy to strive to common or for common or at least convertible methodologies, but that ambition levels need to be different between different countries. And it seemed, I think that was like an interesting remark by Michael there, that with consumption-based approaches like carbon footprint policies, it seems to be less problematic to have these different regulatory levels across different countries.